It is my pleasure to introduce today's EdTech Lounge presenter, Professor Tashmin, who is also the Vice Provost Quality Teaching and Learning at the Aga Khan University. Dr. Khamis is the founding director of the Network of Quality Teaching and Learning at Aga Khan University. She has served as president of ECON, which is a network of higher education quality assurance practitioners from 80 universities across the East African community. She's also a board member of the International Network of Quality Assurance Agencies in Higher Education. Dr. Khamis has established the TEACH scheme, which is the first accredited professional development program by Advance HE UK in Pakistan and East Africa, and the AKU Teachers Academy as the first such interdisciplinary teaching academy in the developing world. As Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy UK, Professor Khamis is one of the only 1,000 Principal Fellows around the world, recognizing her strategic leadership in teaching and learning. Dr. Khamis has been appointed to the Global Perspectives Advisory Group by Advance UK and has twice been a judge on Advance HE UK prestigious Global Teaching Excellence Award. With this brief introduction, I welcome Dr. Khamis to today's EdTech Lounge, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Azra. I hope you can all hear me well, and very happy to see all of you online from East Africa, Pakistan, Central Asia, and beyond. Karibu sana, as we say here, or Kushamadid. Let me start sharing my screen. Okay. All right, so I'm going to speak for the next 10-15 minutes about this from the rapid transition to the new normal. What opportunities does the digital environment offer us or afford us for teaching effectiveness? As you've heard from Azra, my experience is very much at the strategic level. And so a disclaimer is that I have been playing, if you like, a bird's eye view through this last 5 months of rapid transition and thinking forward to what does this mean for universities like our own. But having said that, I am also reflecting, and my glasses are, the lens is from the perspective also of being a faculty member that has dabbled with technology despite being a technological dinosaur in many ways in terms of enhancing teaching since 2011, when I had the opportunity as a student actually of Azra's through the blended learning faculty development program that some of you will be familiar with since 2011. So that's just some background as to where my reflections will come from today. So, as we start, perhaps in the chat box, some of you can look at this graph. I know it is a bit fuzzy purposely. But can you tell me, when you look at this graph, what's the first thing you think of? What does it depict? What does it show? So just take a minute to tell me that, and I'm going to just have a look in the chat box as to what you're saying. Okay, so what are some of you saying in the chat box? When you saw that a sudden sharp increase, says Yasmin Mehboob, including trend growth, what increase might it be, this growth, this trend? Any ideas, anyone? Do you remember COVID? Yeah, increase in COVID. KD says, Anil says COVID. Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to go back to that graph. Absolutely. It is a graph that shows us, you can see the source is WHO, and it is a regional graph of the rapid exponential growth of COVID over time. But this, as some of you have also alluded to, oh, there it is, okay, is that this could also be a graph that depicts our use of technology in teaching and learning. It has been exponential. It has been rapid, and it was something that we were really not ready for across the world. I'm not just mentioning AKU. And those of you who have been involved in this rapid transition, all of our faculty at AKU, I suspect that's the same for other universities, for schools. You need to take your hand, pat yourself on the back, because you're probably sitting with no one next to you, I hope. And you have done a remarkable job in that transition. And however, we must also acknowledge that that transition is not necessarily the way we would want to go down this route of teaching online. And many have likened it to building a plane whilst flying it. We have had to put everything in place and teach. Some of us within a couple of weeks. I know in East Africa that was the case. And we know from our experience that this takes a lot longer. But from our experience, what we know is that this often takes people a lot longer to do well. And so what they normally do, and we have seen this the world over, and we have seen this at AKU, is what we see happening is what people are calling quaranteaching. Faculty, teachers mirror what they did in the face-to-face classroom. And really, in reality, this takes much longer than the 1 or 2 weeks we all had to prepare. Azra and Abir, I'm really sorry, but for some reason, what I was saying is this quaranteaching, we mirror what we do in the face-to-face classroom. And often that has been quite didactic and not necessarily using the technology we want. So what happens is we spend hours and hours in front of Zoom or MS Teams teaching synchronously. Our students, they shut off their videos and we have no idea if they're even there. But we mirror what we do because we're not comfortable with the digital environment. And what we know from our own experience in the Blended Learning Faculty Development Program that Azra and her team in Blended Digital Learning put on since 2011, and we have four cohorts or 10% of our faculty at AKU who have been through this program. It took us 9 months to convert a face-to-face course into a blended or online course. And what we have done through COVID and the pandemic is we have taken this same process, truncated it, and really done this within a couple of weeks. So we haven't had the time to really use the digital media in the way that we could have done if we had time. And now we're in a situation where in many of our countries, our governments have said, you can start opening up. And we're talking about a return to campus. And all our focus, quite rightly, is, are we campus ready in terms of health and safety? But we also need to really focus on our teaching and learning. What does this mean for teaching and learning? And we know from the literature that once you start using the digital environment, it is unlikely that you are just going to go back to purely face-to-face teaching. In addition, we know that we can't afford to have everybody on campus at the same time because of the physical distancing that is required. And so most likely it will be a blended approach that we are looking at as we move forward. And this is good because we know from a long, long time ago that, as John Dewey said, if we teach today as we taught yesterday, we will rob our students of a tomorrow. So the reality is that the technology is what they are there ready to use, and we need to also embrace that as we move forward. But we must also realize that as we move to the new normal, technology is just the tool. It isn't some magic wand that's going to improve all our teaching overnight, as we saw with COVID. That's not necessarily what happened. And just as we used a slate many years ago or a pen and paper more recently, using an iPad or some sort of device is just the tool for us to use to enhance and assist our learning. But what matters the most is the faculty member. It is the teacher. It is the competence. It is your motivation. And what worked well for us at AKU was the tremendous commitment of the faculty. I mean, you coming and giving your time, your lunchtime on a Wednesday every week like you're doing today is just one example of that. So we must celebrate the faculty for that. We must indeed reward and recognize them for that. And we must also realize that in addition, what is important is that whatever the tool, face-to-face, blended, whatever the methodology, iPad or note and paper or Blackboard, what matters is the learning outcome. And we need to keep that central because we promise our graduates that they will leave our institution with certain graduate attributes. So when we think about what modality we will teach in as we move forward, because COVID, we will never have a world without COVID, I suspect, or it will be a long time for that to happen. So if we move forward in this COVID world, where we open up our campuses, we need to start making decisions thinking about that learning outcome and what best the learning outcome actually provides us in terms of moving forward. So if we are at the lower levels of the taxonomy, where we're talking about understanding and remembering, and where we have low student-faculty interactions, we might well afford a flipped approach where we have things online. But as we go higher up the hierarchy to creating and analyzing and evaluating, where the interactions matter between students and their peers or faculty, then we may indeed want to have more face-to-face or a mixture of face-to-face and online. So I want to move on to some review findings that we had at AKU. In 2014 of the Faculty Development Program, and more recently out of a unit review of my unit. And these were some of the findings from those reviews when we looked at teaching with technology. Students felt there was more flexibility and control over their learning. Faculty actually used the pedagogical tools and technology to increase student engagement. compared to lecturing on a podium as sage on the stage. Blended learning was seen as a positive delivery mode for AKU, and our Moodle or our virtual learning environment has become a staple for the student learning experience. So we have a lot to build on, and we're not starting from a clean slate. When we look at faculty reflections from these reviews, there's some there for you to read, but I want to highlight a couple. As one faculty member said, blended learning has questioned our standard teaching practices. Why are we so concerned about participation grading online when in face-to-face teaching our measures of participation is just attendance? Why do we assume students are learning in class just because we are there and we are teaching? So here's a faculty member reflecting on how some assumptions she took or he took for granted in the face-to-face classroom, they are questioning in the online environment. And then you hear another reflection: don't believe anyone who tells you distance learning means less contact time per student. It just isn't true. For in the face-to-face classroom, you can zap all your students at once. And if we move to student reflections, there's some there for you to read, but I will mention a couple. Being in blended learning is like having a group of people explain something to you, each in their own way, each using a different method of explanation until you understand. In a lecture, there is just one person talking, and sometimes you don't really understand the concept. So you hear this student talking about more peer learning happening, more time to reflect perhaps. And then you also hear an interesting comment: I tried harder because I knew my friends would see my work. And that transparency is coming through because everything now is out there online, whether it's in the wiki or the discussion board. So I thought that was a very interesting reflection. So here are some of the positive comments coming from our stakeholders. And that led me to thinking about our own AKU teaching learning framework and what our student evaluation of teaching is set against. Those 7 principles of Chickering and Gamson of good teaching. And I took each of those 7 principles and I analyzed and reflected, upon those for myself. So the first principle is around encouraging a contact between students and faculty. So you've heard that comment from the faculty member, and potentially, even though there is the distance, we can look at taking the distance out of distance learning. And depending on class size, potentially there is actually more contact enabled by the online environment between a faculty and a student. The second principle on developing reciprocity and cooperation among students. So there was that student feedback that pointed to this, that promoted greater participation and peer feedback. Using active learning techniques, I think this is as doable in a face-to-face classroom, perhaps some would argue more so, but I think from our experience and what I've heard through these EdTech lounges, that if you know how to engage your learner face-to-face, you are more inclined to think of ways to do that online. And there are tools to do it, and software that we might look at, that we can engage our learners better. Giving prompt feedback, of course, this is something that we know we struggle with sometimes even in the face-to-face setting. But what I am really encouraged by is how much discussion there's been even at the EdTech lounges about formative feedback. How do I know my student has understood or learned So that is also something that we seem to be scrutinizing as we teach online. Emphasizes time on task. I think in many ways, we assume self-directed learning is happening outside of class in the face-to-face setting, but because we have to front load things on the VLE, etc., I think there's more transparency often in student effort hours with respect to self-directed learning as we move to asynchronous teaching. So I think, again, these principles hold in the online environment. Communicating high expectations in the same way. On the VLE, we front load, everything has to be transparent and up there. And we have our course outlines, we have our rubrics, they're all posted online. And if we've given a good orientation to students, then they will navigate that and know what we expect of them. And then finally, respects diverse talents and ways of learning. And I think, again, what I've seen from my experience and what I see of others is actually we often enable better participation as the online environment provides a voice for all and not just the more vocal. I think with support, we can also increase access and reach. And I know IED has some good examples of how they've managed to promote equity among students with special needs. So just to end, I want to also acknowledge that as this Swahili proverb says, it takes a village to raise a child. It also takes more than a teacher to teach online. We need an enabling environment. And it's not just about the teacher, although the teacher is critical, but it is about IT support. It is about faculty development support. It is about, you know, all sorts of areas with respect to access, with respect to the student experience. So this has to be a very coordinated effort. And so faculty should expect and should seek support. And I've highlighted some of these areas that the BDL team in particular have been very proactive around. I think it also requires us to reward and recognize the faculty for what they do, and we have schemes to do that, like the Teach scheme. And it also requires the coordination as the coordination group has set up. And finally, I would say that what I feel is the opportunity out of this crisis is the way we are scrutinizing teaching like never before. The four key things I have heard the most, and I think I've attended 90% of these EdTech lounges, is, you know, how do I engage the learner? How do I know our students are participating? How do we assess learning in the online environment? And how do we ensure equity for access and learning? And as the cartoon goes back to the same story of the whistle and the dog, that just because I taught you doesn't mean you learned. I think that is as key to face-to-face teaching as it is online. And I hope as we move forward from the rapid transition to the new normal, whatever the mode of delivery, I suspect it will be more blended. We will continue to ask these very important questions. Thank you.